The cruelest betrayal isn't when strangers take your place. It's when your own family sets another seat at your table and expects you to thank them for it. The lawyer's polished shoes echoed across the marble floor, just as my mother lifted her champagne glass with a smile bright enough to fool anyone who hadn't lived in this house. Beside her stood a young woman in an ivory dress, her hands folded nervously in front of her, while relatives applauded as though they were celebrating a miracle instead of tearing apart a marriage that had lasted almost 9 years. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 41 years old, born and raised outside Charlotte, North Carolina, and until that afternoon I believed there were still some lines family would never cross. I was wrong. My father adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "It's time this family had a son," he announced proudly. "We've all agreed this is the best solution." Around the dining room, heads nodded without hesitation. Aunts smiled. Uncles clapped me on the shoulder. Cousins whispered about fresh beginnings. They spoke as if my wife wasn't standing less than 10 feet away, calm enough to make the silence feel heavier than any argument ever could. Victoria didn't interrupt anyone. She didn't cry. She didn't plead for dignity. She simply rested one hand on the back of her chair and watched every face around that table with an expression so unreadable it unsettled me more than anger ever could. My mother stepped toward the young woman and wrapped an affectionate arm around her shoulders. "Lily will give this family the future we've been waiting for," she said. "You'll finally have the son this family deserves." My stomach tightened. For months the conversations had started as harmless suggestions, then quiet pressure, then relentless reminders that our daughters were not enough for generations of Carter men who believed family names only traveled through sons. Victoria had endured every remark with grace I could never understand. Every holiday dinner became another debate. Every birthday became another opportunity for someone to mention legacy, inheritance, or tradition. Somewhere along the way, tradition became permission to forget compassion. I opened my mouth, searching for words that could stop whatever nightmare had taken over my home. But before I spoke, my father slid a folder across the polished oak table. "Everything has already been arranged," he said. "Lawyers, agreements, the ceremony. We only need your signature." My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Sometimes the worst moments arrive so quietly your mind refuses to believe they're real. I looked toward Victoria, expecting disbelief, heartbreak, anything that matched the storm building inside me. Instead, she glanced toward the front entrance where another set of footsteps approached with steady confidence. The family barely noticed the man carrying a slim leather briefcase until he stopped beside her chair. He offered Victoria a respectful nod before placing a thick envelope onto the table. My mother frowned. "Who invited him?" she asked. Victoria finally smiled. It wasn't a smile of revenge. It wasn't satisfaction either. It was the calm expression of someone who had already accepted the ending long before everyone else realized the story had changed. She folded her hands together and looked directly at my parents. "Before anyone welcomes a new wife into this family," she said softly, "there's one small detail you should probably hear first." The room stayed perfectly still after Victoria spoke. Even the crystal chandelier seemed to lose its sparkle as every eye shifted from her to the unfamiliar attorney standing quietly beside her chair. He did not rush to open his briefcase. He did not introduce himself. He simply waited with the patience of someone who knew that truth never needed to compete with noise. 8 weeks earlier, none of us could have imagined our lives would arrive at this moment. Back then, our home looked like the picture people admired from the outside. A brick colonial house on 5 peaceful acres outside Charlotte. White fences, freshly trimmed grass, 2 golden retrievers chasing squirrels across the backyard every Saturday morning. We had 2 beautiful daughters who filled every room with laughter, piano practice, and endless questions about the world. I believed we were building exactly the life we had promised each other. Victoria believed that too, or at least she made me think she did. She never complained when I stayed late at the office. She never questioned another business trip or another dinner with investors. She always greeted me with the same calm smile, asking if I had eaten and reminding me to slow down before another migraine found me. Looking back now, I realize she spent years protecting my peace while quietly carrying burdens I never noticed. The pressure started after my father's 70th birthday. He stood in front of the entire family holding a glass of bourbon and joked that the Carter name would disappear unless someone finally produced a grandson. Everyone laughed except Victoria. She smiled politely, but I noticed the way her fingers tightened around her water glass before she gently changed the subject. After that evening, the comments became impossible to escape. Every Sunday dinner included another reminder. Every holiday turned into another lecture about legacy. My mother clipped articles about ancient family traditions and left them on our kitchen counter. My aunt recommended doctors we never asked about. Even distant cousins suddenly became experts on what a successful family should look like. Victoria answered every insult with kindness that only encouraged them to push harder. She never argued, never defended herself, never blamed anyone. She simply continued running our home with the same quiet grace she always had. I told myself the pressure would fade. Families eventually found something new to gossip about. Instead, it grew louder. One evening, I came home to find my parents sitting in our living room without calling first. My father spoke about family duty while my mother carefully avoided looking at Victoria altogether. Before leaving, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "Sometimes sacrifice is necessary for the greater good." I assumed she meant another fertility specialist or another uncomfortable conversation. I never imagined she was already planning an entirely different future. Across the room, Victoria met my eyes that evening with a softness I still cannot forget. There was sadness there, but something else as well. It was the look of someone who already knew how the story would unfold, yet chose to let everyone else keep writing the wrong ending. The first time I saw Lily Brooks, she was standing beside my mother in the garden behind my parents' house, smiling politely while helping arrange flowers for my niece's birthday party. At the time, she seemed like nothing more than another family friend invited for the afternoon. She spoke softly, laughed at my mother's stories, and introduced herself as an elementary school teacher who had recently moved back to North Carolina after several years in Tennessee. There was nothing unusual about the meeting. Nothing that made me think she would one day be standing inside my own dining room while my family discussed replacing my wife as if they were renovating an old kitchen. Looking back, every piece had already been placed on the board long before I understood there was even a game. My mother began mentioning Lily almost every week. She praised her kindness, her traditional values, her love for children, and how devoted she was to family. At first I barely listened. I assumed it was another one of her harmless attempts to play matchmaker for one of my single cousins. Then the conversations changed. My father stopped talking about grandchildren in general and started talking specifically about grandsons. My aunt reminded everyone that the Carter family business had always passed from father to son. My uncle repeated stories about our ancestors, as though history itself demanded obedience. Every discussion somehow circled back to the same conclusion without anyone saying it directly. Victoria heard every word. She poured coffee, cleared plates, asked if anyone wanted dessert. Her composure never cracked, but I started noticing the silence she carried home afterward. We would drive back beneath the Carolina evening sky with nothing but the sound of tires rolling across quiet highways. I asked her once if my parents had gone too far. She looked out the passenger window for several long seconds before answering. People only reveal who they truly are when they believe they have the right to control someone else's future. I wanted to argue. I wanted to defend my family. Instead, I convinced myself they were simply trapped inside outdated traditions that would eventually fade away. I underestimated how determined they had become. 3 weeks later, my mother called asking me to stop by her house alone because she wanted to discuss an important family matter. When I arrived, Lily was already sitting in the living room beside my parents. Tea had been prepared. Legal pads rested neatly on the coffee table. My father spoke with the calm confidence of a man presenting a business proposal instead of dismantling his son's marriage. He explained that the family had found a practical solution to preserve the Carter bloodline. Lily, he said, understood the importance of tradition and had agreed to help the family continue its legacy. My pulse pounded inside my ears. I laughed because the idea sounded too absurd to be real. Nobody else laughed. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand with heartbreaking sincerity. "Victoria will understand eventually," she whispered. "Good women always sacrifice for their families." At that exact moment, I realized they were not speaking about an impossible fantasy anymore. They believed they had already decided the future for every person sitting in that room, including the one woman whose quiet strength none of them had ever bothered to understand. Driving home that night, I expected Victoria to be angry, hurt, or at least willing to tell me exactly what she thought about my family's unbelievable proposal. Instead, she rolled down the passenger window, letting the cool Carolina air drift through the truck while the last light of sunset disappeared behind rows of towering oak trees. For nearly 20 miles, neither of us spoke. The silence was not hostile. It felt older than that, like the quiet inside an old church where every whispered word carried more weight than a shout. Finally, I apologized. I told her I had never agreed with my parents and never would. I promised I would make them stop. Victoria smiled gently without looking at me. Some people only stop when reality speaks louder than promises, she said. At the time, I assumed she meant time would eventually change their minds. I had no idea she was speaking about something far larger than family opinions. 10 years earlier, when I met Victoria, my life looked nothing like it did now. I had one small office above a hardware store, an aging pickup truck with more miles than I cared to admit, and a consulting business that survived month to month. There were weeks when paying the electric bill felt like winning a negotiation. Clients came and went. Banks politely rejected every expansion loan I requested. I remember sitting alone one rainy Thursday afternoon staring at another declined application, wondering whether it was finally time to close the company before it buried me in debt. That was the afternoon Victoria walked into my office carrying 2 coffees and a notebook filled with handwritten ideas. She had spent the previous 3 nights studying every financial statement I had left scattered across our dining room table. Instead of telling me to give up, she calmly explained why every bank had reached the same conclusion. My pricing model was wrong. My contracts carried too much risk. My cash flow looked unstable because I accepted projects without restructuring payment schedules. She was not criticizing me. She was solving problems I did not even realize existed. Over the next 18 months, everything changed. She negotiated better supplier agreements, redesigned our accounting system, introduced professional budgeting software, and convinced me to focus on commercial clients instead of chasing dozens of smaller residential contracts. Revenue slowly climbed. Then it doubled. Then opportunities arrived faster than we could accept them. Whenever people congratulated me for building a successful company, Victoria quietly stepped back and let me receive every compliment. She never corrected anyone. She never mentioned the nights she spent reviewing contracts until 2 in the morning or the weekends she sacrificed organizing financial reports while I met new clients. Even after we purchased our home and expanded into 3 offices across the state, she remained exactly the same woman I had married. Calm, patient, invisible whenever praise entered the room. Looking back now, I realize my family admired the success, but never once asked who had built the foundation beneath it. They saw me standing in front of the company logo during interviews and assumed the entire story belonged to me. Victoria never tried to change that assumption. She simply continued protecting everything we had created together, carrying responsibilities no one else could see. And somehow, while everyone celebrated the Carter family legacy, they completely overlooked the quiet architect who had been holding the entire structure together from the very beginning. The weeks that followed felt strangely ordinary on the surface, which is how the most dangerous storms usually begin. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued across the dinner table. Instead, my family acted as though a decision had already been made, and all that remained was waiting for everyone else to accept it. My mother began calling less often, but when she did, she never asked how Victoria was doing. She only asked whether I had thought about the future, about the Carter name, about responsibilities that supposedly stretched beyond one lifetime. My father became unusually interested in company matters. He wanted updated financial reports, asked detailed questions about expansion plans, and casually wondered how ownership would be divided one day. At the time, I assumed retirement had simply made him curious about the business I had spent years building. Looking back, every question had a destination. Every conversation was another step toward a future they believed already belonged to them. Victoria noticed everything without commenting on any of it. She continued preparing breakfast before sunrise, reminding our daughters about school projects, and making certain I never left the house without lunch packed neatly inside my briefcase. Nothing about her routine changed, yet there was a quiet precision in everything she did that I had never appreciated before. One Saturday morning, I walked into my home office expecting to find tax documents spread across the desk. Instead, Victoria was organizing folders into separate storage boxes labeled with dates stretching back almost a decade. Contracts, property records, banking statements, insurance policies, partnership agreements. She worked carefully, page after page, placing each document inside protective sleeves with almost unbelievable patience. I asked if we were preparing for an audit. She smiled without looking up. I simply believe important things deserve to be organized before someone else decides to organize them for you. The answer sounded practical enough, but something inside me lingered on those words long after I left the room. During the following days, I noticed other small changes. She scheduled meetings downtown without explaining whom she was seeing. She spent an afternoon at our bank and another at an accounting firm we had not visited in years. One evening, she returned carrying nothing except a slim leather portfolio that disappeared into the safe inside our study. I almost asked about it before deciding I trusted her completely. Trust had never been difficult between us. That was probably why I failed to recognize preparation when it stood right in front of me. Meanwhile, my family grew bolder. My mother invited Lily to another gathering and introduced her to relatives as though she already belonged inside the Carter family. My aunt joked that our daughters would finally have a baby brother to spoil. Even neighbors who had known Victoria for years began hearing carefully crafted stories suggesting she supported the family's wishes for the sake of tradition. The lie spread with remarkable speed because comfortable lies usually travel farther than uncomfortable truths. Victoria never corrected anyone. She attended every gathering with the same calm smile, speaking kindly to Lily whenever their paths crossed. There was no bitterness in her voice, no resentment in her expression. Only once did I catch something different. As we were leaving my parents' house, she paused beside the front porch and looked back at everyone laughing through the dining room window. "People become careless," she said quietly, "when they mistake kindness for weakness." Then she opened the truck door, fastened her seat belt, and stared ahead into the fading evening light while I drove home, still believing the hardest part of our story had not yet arrived. The invitation arrived on thick ivory paper with gold lettering, as though elegance could disguise cruelty. My parents called it a family celebration, a dinner to honor new beginnings and the future of the Carter name. Every relative received the same invitation. So did Lily. Victoria received one as well, addressed exactly the same as always, with her full name written in careful script beneath mine. If someone had looked only at the envelope, they would have believed nothing had changed. The truth waited inside the house where every chair had already been assigned a purpose. Victoria read the invitation once, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the fruit bowl in the kitchen. She did not sigh. She did not ask whether we should attend. Instead, she looked at me with the same calm eyes that had carried us through every difficult season of our marriage. "We should go," she said. "Sometimes people deserve the opportunity to reveal exactly who they are." The sentence lingered in my mind for days. Meanwhile, her quiet preparations continued. One Tuesday afternoon, she asked if I could pick up our daughters from school because she had several appointments downtown. I offered to cancel my meetings and go with her. She thanked me but declined. "There are some things I need to finish on my own," she replied with a gentle smile. Later that evening, I noticed 3 business cards resting beside her notebook before she slipped them into the leather portfolio I had seen weeks earlier. One belonged to a senior attorney specializing in corporate law. Another belonged to a certified public accountant. The third carried only the name of a private trust administrator. I recognized each profession, yet I could not understand why all 3 suddenly mattered. When I asked if something was wrong, Victoria reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Everything is exactly as it should be," she answered. "I am simply making certain it stays that way." Her confidence should have comforted me. Instead, it filled me with questions I could not explain. 2 days before the dinner, my father stopped by my office unexpectedly. He closed the door behind him and spoke in the measured tone he always used when discussing business. He suggested it was finally time to simplify future ownership of the company before retirement complicated everything. He even offered to introduce me to advisors who could restructure assets for the next generation. I almost laughed at the coincidence, unaware that another set of advisors had already been quietly reviewing every document connected to our lives. That evening, I found Victoria standing alone on our back porch watching the sunset stretch across the fields beyond our property. The warm breeze moved gently through her hair, while our daughters chased fireflies across the yard, laughing without a single worry about the world adults had created around them. I walked beside her and apologized again for everything my family had put her through. She leaned lightly against my shoulder for a moment before speaking. "Do you know why strong foundations survive storms?" she asked softly. I admitted I did not. Because they were built correctly long before the storm arrived. She looked toward the horizon where the last light faded into evening. "Tomorrow everyone will believe they are celebrating a new beginning," she whispered. "They do not realize they are about to discover how the old one was built." The dining room shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers as though elegance alone could erase the ugliness hidden beneath the evening. Every place setting had been arranged with perfect precision. Fine china, polished silver, fresh white roses running the length of the table. My mother welcomed guests with effortless confidence, while my father moved from conversation to conversation, accepting congratulations for what several relatives openly called the beginning of a new chapter for the Carter family. I stood near the fireplace, feeling like a stranger inside my own life. Victoria arrived beside me, wearing a simple navy blue dress she had owned for years. There were no expensive diamonds, no dramatic entrance, no attempt to compete for anyone's attention. Somehow that quiet confidence made her impossible to ignore. People greeted her politely, but I noticed the hesitation behind every smile. They already believed she was becoming part of the past. Lily entered a few minutes later accompanied by my mother. Several relatives applauded softly, as though she had accomplished something worthy of celebration simply by walking into the room. My aunt hugged her warmly and introduced her to distant cousins using words that made my stomach twist. "She is the future of this family," she said proudly. Lily smiled with visible discomfort. More than once she glanced toward Victoria, as if hoping someone would explain why none of this felt right. Dinner passed beneath forced laughter and carefully rehearsed conversations. My father raised a toast praising family tradition, sacrifice, and the importance of preserving the Carter legacy for future generations. Every sentence seemed designed to justify decisions that had never belonged to him. Finally, he placed his glass on the table and looked directly at me. "Tonight we celebrate courage," he announced. "Some choices are difficult, but true leaders think beyond themselves." The room erupted in approving nods. Then my mother stood and gently invited Lily to join her beside the head of the table. "It is time everyone accepts what is best for this family," she declared. My heartbeat echoed so loudly I barely heard the front door open. The familiar attorney stepped inside, carrying the same slim leather briefcase I had seen beside Victoria weeks earlier. He walked calmly through the crowded dining room, while confused whispers spread from one end of the table to the other. My father frowned. "Excuse me," he said sharply. "This is a private family dinner." The attorney stopped beside Victoria without acknowledging anyone else. "Mrs. Carter," he said respectfully, "everything is ready." Victoria rose slowly from her chair. No anger crossed her face. No satisfaction either. Only quiet certainty. She accepted a sealed envelope from the attorney and placed it gently on the polished table between my parents and me. My mother let out a small laugh. "What is this supposed to be?" she asked. Victoria met her eyes with the same calm expression she had carried through every insult, every rumor, and every impossible conversation. "You have spent months deciding who deserves this family," she said softly. "Tonight we can finally discuss who actually owns it." The attorney opened his briefcase, removed several neatly organized folders, and placed them beside the envelope one by one. The sound of each folder touching the table seemed louder than the applause that had filled the room only moments earlier. Nobody reached for a glass. Nobody spoke. For the first time all evening, the Carter family stopped celebrating long enough to wonder whether they had misunderstood everything from the very beginning. The attorney opened the first folder with the calm precision of someone who had repeated the same process hundreds of times before. He did not raise his voice or attempt to command the room. He simply placed the first document in front of my father. "Articles of organization," he said evenly. "Carter Commercial Holdings, filed 10 years ago." My father barely glanced at the page before pushing it aside with a dismissive smile. "I have seen our company paperwork before," he replied confidently. The attorney nodded politely. "Perhaps not this version." He turned the document toward the center of the table. My eyes followed the highlighted lines until they reached the ownership schedule. 92% controlling interest. Managing member, Victoria and Carter. My breath caught. I looked from the paper to Victoria, waiting for her to tell me there had been some mistake. She simply stood beside her chair with the same composed expression she had worn all evening. The attorney continued before anyone could interrupt. Another folder appeared. Then another. The deed to our headquarters. The commercial warehouse outside Raleigh. The distribution facility near Greensboro. The intellectual property registrations. The operating agreements. Every page carried the same conclusion. Legal ownership rested with Victoria. My father reached for his reading glasses with trembling hands. My mother leaned over his shoulder, her confident smile fading line by line. That cannot be right, she whispered. Ethan built all of this. Victoria answered softly. He did. We built it together. But when every bank rejected our financing, they required one condition before approving our restructuring. The attorney picked up another document. Mrs. Carter personally guaranteed every loan with inherited assets placed into a private trust established by her late grandfather. Because she accepted the financial liability, the ownership structure reflected that responsibility from the beginning. Silence settled across the dining room. I remembered those difficult years. I remembered signing stacks of paperwork after exhausting meetings with lenders. I remembered trusting Victoria whenever she quietly slid another signature page across the table, believing we were simply doing whatever was necessary to keep the company alive. I had never stopped to ask whose name carried the greater risk because I never imagined she would shield me from it without expecting recognition. The attorney continued with measured clarity. Every expansion over the last decade was financed through that same trust. Every major acquisition, every commercial property, every controlling share was purchased under the existing ownership structure. My aunt slowly lowered her wine glass. My uncle stared at the documents without speaking. Lily looked completely stunned, taking one uncertain step backward as though she had accidentally wandered into someone else's story. My father finally looked directly at Victoria. Why did you never tell us? His voice had lost every trace of authority. Victoria met his eyes without anger. Because I married into a family, not a competition. She paused for only a moment. I believed character mattered more than titles. Then she looked around the room at every relative who had spent months deciding her future without once asking about her past. You assumed ownership belonged to the loudest voice at the table. You never noticed the person quietly carrying the weight beneath it. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. The celebration that had begun with certainty now sat buried beneath a stack of legal documents and a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade. Nobody moved for several long seconds. The only sound inside the dining room came from the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking another minute that suddenly felt far more important than the years that had come before it. My father remained seated with both hands resting on the stack of documents, as though holding the papers tightly enough might somehow change the words printed across them. My mother stared at Victoria with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not disbelief. It looked more like the painful realization that certainty had quietly become arrogance. Lily was the first person to speak. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I did not know any of this. Victoria turned toward her with remarkable kindness. I believe you. There was no accusation in her answer. No bitterness. Only honesty. Lily looked around the room at the faces that had convinced her she was helping preserve a family tradition. Slowly, she removed the small bracelet my mother had given her earlier that evening and placed it gently on the dining table. I cannot be part of something that was built on hiding the truth, she said before quietly walking toward the front door. No one tried to stop her. They were too busy confronting the consequences of their own choices. I looked at Victoria, searching for the right words after everything I had learned. Every memory from the past decade returned with painful clarity. The late nights she spent beside spreadsheets while I slept. The meetings she attended without asking for recognition. The confidence she carried whenever life became uncertain. I had thanked her countless times over the years, but I suddenly realized I had never fully understood the weight she had been carrying for both of us. Why did you protect me from all of this? I asked quietly. She smiled with the same warmth that had first made me fall in love with her. Because marriage is supposed to be a partnership, not a scoreboard, she answered. I never wanted you to feel smaller so that I could appear greater. Her words settled over the room with more force than any argument ever could. The attorney closed the final folder and stepped back respectfully. His work complete, Victoria gathered nothing from the table except the envelope she had carried into the room. Every document remained where it was, allowing everyone present to see the truth they had ignored for years. She walked toward my parents and stopped beside their chairs. "I am not taking your family away," she said gently. "You chose to push me out before you understood what I had given to keep this family standing." My father lowered his eyes. For the first time in my life, he had no advice, no lecture, no speech about legacy. Only silence. Victoria reached for my hand. I held it without hesitation. Together we walked toward the front door while our daughters waited outside with the sitter who had brought them home earlier that evening. As we stepped onto the front porch, the cool North Carolina air felt lighter than it had in months. I looked back once at the house where so much had changed in a single night. The walls were still standing. The lights still glowed through every window. Yet nothing inside was the same. I finally understood that real strength is rarely loud. It does not demand applause or announce itself at the head of the table. Sometimes it works quietly for years, carrying more weight than anyone notices until the day the truth finally speaks for itself. And that night, the greatest inheritance our daughters received was never a company, a house, or a family name. It was the lesson that character will always outlast pride, and that the people who build the strongest foundations are often the ones the world overlooks until everything else begins to fall away.